Can you hear that whisper in the static? I've just intercepted an unusual transmission, a strange signal cutting through the natural hum of the forest that isn't coming from any standard radio. Instead, it appears to be originating from somewhere entirely different, a source that watches with a curious intent. In the depths of some ancient woodlands, I've picked up fragments that seem to focus on a lumberjack hard at work. Amid the steady rhythm of chainsaw cuts and the rustle of pines under a pale moon, this signal, disjointed and eerie, seems to be studying him as if considering his every move. He remains oblivious, lost in his labor, while above him something inexplicable hovers in the ether. There's a palpable sense of anticipation in this transmission, a quiet inquiry from an unknown observer. What might be in store for this solitary figure? And from where does this bizarre signal emanate? The answer is hidden in the fading echoes of a reality we thought we understood. So lean in and listen closely. Together, we might yet unravel the secrets behind this unsettling frequency and discover what awaits when the familiar world meets the unfathomable unknown.
Travis tightened his grip on the chainsaw, its metal teeth biting into the thick trunk of an ancient cedar. The forest stretched endlessly around him, shadows dancing between the trees under the indifferent gaze of the moon. The cool air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar aroma that had become his solace in the solitude of these nights. He moved with practiced precision, each cut deliberate, the steady rhythm of his work a counterpoint to the stillness enveloping them. His team worked in silent coordination, their breaths visible in the crisp night air, merging with the mist that clung to the ground. The forest was alive yet quiet, a living entity watching them as they cleared the deadwood to prevent the inevitable wildfires threatening this secluded expanse. Travis glanced around, the dense canopy above filtering moonlight into scattered beams that danced on the forest floor. The trees stood tall and imposing, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. The profound stillness was broken only by the mechanical whir of the chainsaw and the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures settling into their hidden lives. He found comfort in the isolation, a stark contrast to the crowded chaos of the city life he had left behind. "Keep it up, Travis. We're making good progress." Marcus's voice crackled from the radio, low and steady. Marcus was the unofficial leader of their small crew, his presence another reliable constant amidst the repetitive grind of their work. Travis nodded, returning his focus to the task at hand, the saw moving in and out of the wood with mechanical regularity. As minutes turned into hours, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. The only light came from their headlamps and the cold glow of the moon. Travis's muscles ached from the continuous motion, but fatigue was a welcome companion, masking the underlying tension that had settled over him since dusk. He paused for a moment, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. The night was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of the forest muted, as if nature itself was wary of disturbing their work. Travis scanned the perimeter, eyes adjusting to the darkness, searching for any signs of movement that might indicate the presence of wildlife. "Everything good on your end?" Marcus inquired. "Yeah, all clear," Travis replied, pushing off the tree and returning to his position. He felt a prickle of unease, but dismissed it, focusing instead on the rhythm of his work. The predictability of it all was grounding, keeping his mind occupied and away from the creeping sense that something was amiss. The night deepened, the temperature dropping as the moon climbed higher. Travis's thoughts wandered to times past, memories that seemed a world away. The forest had become his refuge, a place where he could disconnect from the world and lose himself in the monotony of his labor. Yet tonight, that simplicity felt fractured, the air charged with an unspoken tension. A sudden sound pierced the silence, a high-pitched whine that sliced through the trees, unlike any natural noise Travis had ever heard. It felt almost alive, a jarring presence in the quiet, breathing stillness of the forest. He froze, the chainsaw halting mid-air, the freshly cut end of the log suspended in the glow of his headlamp. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hiss of radio static. Marcus stopped, his distant chainsaw falling silent. "Hear what?" came the response through the radio. That sound." Travis gestured vaguely, but the whine seemed to emanate from all directions, a disorienting cacophony clashing with the night's natural symphony. Before Marcus could respond, the whine intensified, growing louder and more insistent, reverberating through the ground and into Travis's bones. The air seemed to shimmer, the once clear night distorted by an unseen force. Travis felt a strange pressure building around him, the trees bending slightly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. "Something's wrong," Marcus muttered, his voice crackling through the tinny speaker. But there was nothing visible, no sign of machinery or anything else that could produce such a sound. Travis's heart began to race, the unease now a tangible presence pressing down on him. He tried to rationalize it, attributing the sound to distant machinery or perhaps an equipment malfunction. But deep down, he knew something was off, something beyond his understanding. Without warning, a blinding flash of light erupted from above, engulfing the entire clearing in a stark, white brilliance. The force of it was overwhelming, pressing him back against the trunk of a tree. The chainsaw clattered to the ground, the noise lost in the roar that accompanied the light. Travis shielded his eyes, but the brightness was relentless, disorienting him further. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. The light intensified, wrapping around him like tendrils of pure energy, pulling him away from the forest floor. He felt himself lifted, the ground slipping away beneath his feet as gravity lost its hold. Panic surged through him, his rational mind scrambling to make sense of the impossible. One moment, he was surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the forest. The next, he was engulfed in an abyss of light and noise. The transition was jarring, the sudden shift from reality to the unknown, pushing his sanity towards the brink. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the intensity of the beam, his screams lost in its overwhelming force. In an instant, the light faded as suddenly as it had appeared, plunging Travis into darkness. The sensation of being lifted vanished, replaced by the oppressive weight of confinement. He was no longer in the forest, but in a cold, metallic chamber. The walls were smooth and featureless, illuminated by a faint artificial light that cast harsh shadows. His body ached, every movement restricted by unyielding metal cuffs. He tried to pull away, to find a way out, but the restraints were unbreakable, their grip firm and merciless. Panic gave way to desperation as he struggled, his mind fraying ever further under the strain of the unknown. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint buzz of machinery that surrounded him. He could feel a mask covering his face, muffling his cries and distorting his vision. The mask was cold and alien, its presence a stark reminder that he was no longer in his world. His thoughts raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The change was so sudden, the transition from the forest to this sterile chamber, leaving him disoriented and terrified. The separation from everything he knew was instantaneous and absolute. As seconds dragged on, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was alone, taken by a force he couldn't comprehend. The rational part of his mind fought to maintain control, to find a way out, but the fear and confusion were overwhelming. He couldn't understand what was happening, why he had been taken, What awaited him in this cold, unfamiliar place? His breathing became erratic, his heart pounding in his chest as the enormity of his predicament settled over him. The initial panic gave way to a numbing fear, the rationality he clung to now slipping through his fingers. In the depths of his terror, a faint realization dawned on him. This was no ordinary abduction. The precision, the technology, it was something beyond human, something orchestrated with a purpose he couldn't fathom. His head throbbed with a dull ache, each pulse resonating through his skull like the distant echo of a chainsaw. Disoriented, he attempted to move, only to be met with the unyielding resistance of the restraints that held him firmly in place. Panic surged through him, a visceral fear clawing at his rational mind, urging him to comprehend the inexplicable reality he now faced. The chamber, his prison, was a testament to hyper-minimalist design, every surface gleaming with an unsettling cleanliness that contrasted sharply with the organic chaos of the forest he had left behind. Smooth, seamless panels of silver material stretched out in every direction, their pristine surfaces reflecting the cold, artificial light emanating from hidden sources. The lighting was uniform and harsh, creating an atmosphere of clinical detachment that only amplified Travis's sense of isolation. He took a deep breath, the air crisp and sterile, carrying a faint metallic tang. His lungs burned as he struggled to steady his breathing, the initial surge of adrenaline gradually giving way to a sinking realization of his situation. The silence around him was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of machinery that seemed to monitor his every movement with indifferent precision. Travis's eyes scanned the room, searching for any clue that might explain his sudden transition from the serene isolation of the woods to this cold, unfeeling chamber. The space was vast, yet somehow claustrophobic, its emptiness pressing in from all sides, leaving him feeling both exposed and confined. There were no signs of life, no furniture, no tools, nothing to suggest the purpose of this place beyond its function as his holding cell. He flexed his wrists, the restraints dug into his skin, leaving faint red marks that served as a stark reminder of his captivity. The cuffs were made of a material that felt impossibly strong, yet there was no visible mechanism to tighten or loosen them, no seams or welds. Every movement he attempted was met with an unyielding grip, the restraints holding him firmly in place like shackles. His mind raced, attempting to piece together the fragmented memories of his abduction. The high-pitched whine, the blinding flash of light, the sensation of being lifted into nothingness, all too disjointed to form a coherent narrative. He remembered the forest, the rhythmic chopping of wood, the voices of his team, and then nothing. It was as if his entire existence had been ripped away in an instant, leaving him adrift in an incomprehensible void. His gaze fell upon the panels adorning the walls, their smooth surfaces displaying streams of data that Travis couldn't decipher. Symbols and fluctuating patterns danced across the screens, their meaning lost to him, but undeniably important to those who had brought him here. The technology was far beyond anything he had ever encountered, its sophistication a testament to an intelligence that dwarfed human understanding. "Where am I?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible under the mask. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Travis grappled with the enormity of his situation. He attempted to focus on his surroundings, trying to find patterns or clues that might offer an escape. The minimal design offered no distractions, no hiding spots or weaknesses. Every surface was uniform, every panel identical, leaving him with no obvious vulnerabilities to exploit. It was a marvel of engineering, efficient and impenetrable, a terrifying testament to inhuman technological prowess. He reached out a tentative hand, fingers grazing the surface of the nearest panel, hoping to trigger some form of response. The screen flickered momentarily, the symbols shifting and changing with increasing speed, before returning to their original state. Frustration bubbled within him, the futility of his attempts evident in his clenched fists. There was no apparent way to communicate, to send a message to his captors, to the world outside his containment. His rational mind struggled to maintain composure, to find logical explanations for the impossible situation he found himself in. But logic failed him. The situation defied all known principles of reality. He was a man out of his depth, thrust into a scenario that made no sense, governed by rules he couldn't fathom. The Spartan environment offered no comfort, no sense of familiarity, only the stark reality of his predicament pressing down on him. He closed his eyes, attempting to block out the sterile surroundings and the relentless hum of machinery that seemed to monitor his every vital sign. But even in darkness, he couldn't escape the oppressive atmosphere of the chamber. The isolation he had once found solace in was now his greatest enemy, the vast emptiness of his sudden prison amplifying his sense of loneliness and vulnerability. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm despite the overwhelming fear threatening to consume him. He had always valued the isolation of the forest, the way it allowed him to disconnect from the chaos of the outside world. Now, that same isolation was a sentence, a void that stripped him of his sense of purpose and left him adrift in an incomprehensible environment. Travis's mind continued to fray under the pressure of his circumstances. In desperation, he strained his ears, hoping to catch any sound that might signify a change in his circumstances. But the room remained unnervingly quiet. Without warning, the chamber's lighting flickered briefly before stabilizing, casting an even, harsh glow across the sterile environment. The smooth panels on the walls began to shift subtly, creating an entrance where none had existed before. The movement was silent, almost imperceptible, yet it signaled the arrival of something new. From the narrow opening emerged figures that defied expectation. They were shorter than the average human, their slender bodies moving with an unnatural grace. Their large, bulbous heads loomed above them, disproportionately sized compared to their diminutive frames. The most striking feature was their vast black eyes with barely visible irises, which seemed to pierce through Travis with an unsettling intensity. The creatures moved with precision, their every action methodical and seemingly devoid of emotion. Their skin was a smooth, ashen grey, lacking any distinguishing marks or features aside from their expressive eyes. They wore minimal attire, tight-fitting silver jumpsuits that accentuated their otherworldly forms. Despite their lack of verbal communication, an air of authority surrounded them, instilling an immediate sense of dread in Travis. One of the Greys approached, extending a slender, three-fingered hand that hovered just above his restrained form. There was no attempt to speak. Instead, he felt a wave of thoughts and emotions wash over him, a form of psychic communication that bypassed the need for words. The messages were clear. Remain calm, comply with the procedures. Your cooperation is essential. Travis's heart raced as he attempted to comprehend the unspoken directives. The lack of spoken language only heightened his fear, making the interaction feel even more alien and incomprehensible. The grey creatures showed no signs of empathy or malice, but their presence alone was enough to terrify him. The vastness of their dark eyes seemed to hold secrets he could not fathom, depths that mirrored the isolation he now felt. The lead Grey gestured toward a section of the chamber that began to reconfigure itself into a specialized containment unit. Smooth panels slid silently aside, revealing a sleek, metallic structure. Another Grey moved to assist, every movement fluid and precise as they began the process of transferring Travis into the containment unit. The restraints tightened slightly, adjusting to his body with an almost surgical precision. Travis struggled instinctively, but the cuffs held firm, the material unyielding against his attempts to break free. As he was secured, the psychic communication intensified, a flood of information and directives that left him feeling even more disoriented. Images flashed before his eyes, schematics of the containment unit, data streams flowing across the chamber walls, glimpses of the ship's vast interior. The information was overwhelming, too much for his mind to process all at once. Travis's resistance waned as the Greys methodically completed the containment process. The chamber's environment shifted subtly, the air growing colder as the unit sealed around him. The final panel slid shut with a soft click, isolating him within the containment unit. The Greys paused for a moment, their dark eyes lingering on him before they turned and retreated back through the entrance. The chamber returned to its previous state of minimalistic design, the only indication of the recent activity being the sealed containment unit now holding Travis. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the faint hum of machinery that continued to monitor his vital signs. Travis sat in silence, the reality of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. The isolation he had once sought in the forest was now amplified 100-fold, trapped within the cold, high-tech confines of this alien vessel. The presence of the Grey entities, their silent authority, and the terrifying efficiency with which they operated, left him feeling utterly powerless and alone. He closed his eyes, attempting to steady his racing heart and quell the panic threatening to overwhelm him. The memories of the forest, the rhythmic chopping of wood, the peaceful solitude, seemed like distant echoes from another life, another world. Now he was a prisoner in an alien vessel, surrounded by beings who communicated through thoughts and observed him with an unblinking gaze. Travis's mind raced with questions. Who were these beings? What did they want from him? Why had he been chosen? The lack of answers only deepened his fear, leaving him grappling with the enormity of his abduction and the uncertain fate that awaited him. His attempts to cling to rational thought began to falter under the relentless pressure. The sterile environment became a catalyst for his mental unraveling. The vast emptiness of the chamber mirrored the void he felt inside, each unanswered question a heavy weight dragging him deeper into despair. His breathing became erratic, each inhale sharp and shallow, his chest tightening with the effort to calm himself. The oppressive silence felt like a physical force pressing down on him, making it difficult to think clearly. Memories of the forest, once his sanctuary, now taunted him with their simplicity and peace, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing within his mind. Travis's thoughts began to spiral, jumping from one frantic question to another, without any semblance of order. The rational part of his mind struggled to maintain control, but the fear was too overpowering. Images from his abduction replayed in his head. The high-pitched whine, the blinding light, the feeling of being lifted into the void, each memory a fragment that refused to be pieced together. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, the edges of his consciousness fraying as panic took hold. His mind, once sharp and focused, now felt like it was being pulled apart, each thought unraveling into chaos. His breathing became futile as his body reacted instinctively to the overwhelming fear. His pulse pounded in his ears, each beat a thunderous reminder of his helplessness. The once steady rhythm of his mind, honed by years of solitary work in the forest, was now replaced by the frantic pumping of a heart fighting for survival. His eyes fluttered open again, a new wave of panic washing over him. The Greys' presence seemed to grow larger in his vision, their dark eyes boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could feel their thoughts pressing against his own, a silent assault that left him reeling. The lack of verbal communication only made their presence more menacing, their intentions inscrutable, their power absolute. Travis's mind began to regress, slipping into a more instinctual state as fear took over. The rational explanations he had clung to were slipping away, replaced by a raw, unfiltered panic that left him gasping for breath. A cold sweat began to issue from every pore. The isolation that had once been his refuge was now a prison, each second stretching into an eternity of fear and confusion. He tried to move again, to break free from the restraints, but his efforts were met with the familiar, unyielding grip. His body tensed, muscles straining against the cuffs, but the material remained unbreakable. Frustration bubbled up, transforming into a primal rage that surged through him, his mind no longer able to contain the torrent of emotions threatening to consume him. His vision began to blur at the edges, the containment unit's harsh lines merging into indistinct shapes. The dark eyes of the Greys still haunted his thoughts, their silent gaze a constant presence that refused to let him escape. The room seemed to close in on him, the sparse design amplifying his sense of imprisonment. His thoughts became a jumbled mess, a cacophony of fear, anger, and desperation that drowned out any remaining semblance of rationality. The symbols on the walls now seemed like mocking reminders of his confusion. Each pattern, each sequence, was a testament to his inability to understand or control his situation. He could feel his mind teetering on the brink, structured thoughts giving way to a chaotic frenzy of panic. His breaths came in ragged gasps now, his body trembling uncontrollably as fear threatened to overtake him completely. Travis's final coherent thought was a desperate primal urge to survive, to escape the relentless grip of fear that held him captive within the cold, high-tech confines of his captivity. Without warning, the chamber's lighting flickered once more before stabilizing, the harsh glow intensifying and casting deep shadows across the sterile environment. Travis's eyes darted toward the entrance, his primate instincts on high alert. A faint movement at the threshold caught his attention. One of the Greys was returning. The figure emerged silently, its large black eyes fixed intently on him. It moved with the same unnerving precision as before, each step measured and deliberate. The minimal attire clung to its slender form, emphasizing its alien nature. There was no warmth in its gaze, only an unyielding focus that sent a chill down Travis's spine. He felt a surge of fear clawing at his chest, his shattered thoughts struggling to keep pace with the overwhelming panic threatening to consume him. He could sense the Grey's intentions through the psychic communication, preparing him for examination. The message was clear, yet its implications were terrifying. His mind continued to unravel, structured thoughts giving way to a chaotic storm of fear and desperation. No, he stammered, sweating profusely as the reality of his situation pressed down on him. Travis's eyes widened, the darkness within them deepening as his fear reached a boiling point. His body tensed, muscles straining against the unyielding restraints, every fiber of his being screaming for freedom. The Grey approached, its presence towering over him, an embodiment of his darkest nightmares. "Stay calm," the Grey's thoughts echoed in his mind, but Travis couldn't comply. The rational part of his brain had long since been overshadowed by primal panic. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping down his temples and pooling beneath his restraints. The once pristine cuffs now showed signs of deterioration, the material weakening under the strain of his desperate attempts to break free. Travis's mind felt like it was being pulled apart, each second stretching into an eternity of fear and confusion. The Grey reached out a slender hand, its three-fingered grip closing around Travis's arm with mechanical precision. "Cooperate," the psychic message reinforced, but Travis's mind was no longer receptive to logic or reason. His thoughts fragmented, slipping into a state where only survival mattered. "Let me go," he growled, his voice echoing into the emptiness around him. His eyes darted about the chamber, his vision trembled at the edges, intense fear causing his pupils to dilate uncontrollably as his panic reached its zenith. A faint hissing noise signaled that the restraints were beginning to fail, the material of the cuffs tearing from the caustic action of his sweat and the relentless pressure of his desperation. Travis could feel the last threads of rationality snapping like over-tightened piano strings as he succumbed to the overwhelming fear dominating him. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he pulled against the restraints, his muscles straining as the cuffs began to give way. The sound of tearing metal echoed softly in the chamber. His heart pounded, each beat a reminder of his quickening loss of control. As the restraints finally gave way, Travis felt a rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The containment unit's walls seemed to disintegrate around him, the once impenetrable barriers now smoke and silver dust. He stood unsteadily, his legs weak from the effort, but the freedom was intoxicating, a brief respite from the fear that had held him captive. But freedom came at a cost. The chamber's lighting surged, the harsh glow intensifying as alarms began to blare, the sound piercing the silence with insistent urgency. Travis's wide eyes darted around the room, meeting the unblinking gaze of the returning Greys, their own dark eyes now filled with a mix of frustration, determination, and panic. The sleek Proximian ship sliced through the void of space, its hull a seamless blend of form and function. The metallic exterior reflected the distant stars, creating the illusion of motion even as the vessel moved at a relativistic speed. Inside, the corridors were bathed in a soft, ambient light that accentuated the minimalist design. Smooth surfaces devoid of unnecessary adornment, technology integrated seamlessly into every facet. Captain Cannell stood in the central command hub, his tall frame poised before a holographic display that hovered mid-air. Streams of data and star charts shifted under his long, slender fingers. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the information with a restless energy. The hum of the ship's engines resonated beneath his feet, a constant reminder of their perpetual journey. "All systems are operating at peak efficiency," Chief Engineer Siscott reported, stepping into the command hub. His hands bore the faint stains of conductive gel, evidence of his recent calibrations. "I've optimized the antimatter flow to increase our fuel efficiency by another 2%, he reported. Cannell nodded absently, his focus still on the hologram. "Excellent work, Siscott. Every increment counts." Siscott hesitated for a moment. "Is there something specific you're looking for, Captain?" "You've been scanning the outer sectors extensively." Cannell's lips curved into a slight smile. "Just keeping an eye out for unique opportunities." Without further explanation, he dismissed Siscott with a curt nod. The engineer frowned, but knew better than to press the matter. He turned and left, the door sliding shut behind him with a whisper. In the adjacent laboratory, Science Officer Flea adjusted the settings on her macroscope. The device emitted a soft hum as it dissected the properties of a crystalline sample retrieved from a dying star. Her eyes narrowed, deep in concentration, as lines of complex data scrolled across the display. Patrick, the medical officer, entered quietly. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing a container of nutrient soup beside her workstation. Flea glanced up, offering a brief smirk. "Trying to keep me from collapsing, Patrick? How thoughtful." He shrugged lightly. "Can't have our top scientist keeling over from exhaustion. It'd reflect poorly on my medical prowess." She took a sip, the warm liquid providing a momentary comfort. "Besides, you'd miss our little chats." "Undoubtedly," he replied dryly. "Any breakthroughs?" "Possibly. This crystal exhibits properties that could revolutionize our energy systems. Or it might just be a glorified paperweight. Time will tell." Meanwhile, in the navigation alcove, Pilot Silo reclined in his chair, boots propped up on the console. His slim fingers danced over the controls, guiding the ship with an effortless confidence born from years of experience. First Officer Theorix approached, her posture rigid. "Solo, I hope the autopilot isn't doing all the work while you take another one of your breaks." He flashed her a roguish grin. "Relax, Thurks. I've got everything under control. We're on course, and all systems are green." The captain expects real-time updates. He won't appreciate any lapses in protocol. Solo swung his feet off the console, sitting up straight. "Noted, First Officer. I'll be sure to dot every T and cross every I." Thurks gave a terse nod before moving on, her expression unreadable. In the lower decks, Resource Acquisition Specialist Ron meticulously inspected the storage units. Rows of compartments held various minerals and elements critical to their mission. He ran a scanner over each one, verifying their integrity. Chief Engineer Sizcott joined him, carrying a toolkit. "Ron, have you noticed any fluctuations in the containment fields?" "None," Ron replied without looking up. "Everything is stable, though I suspect the captain has other interests beyond our stated objectives." Sizcott sighed. "You're not the only one who thinks so. He's been preoccupied." Ron met his gaze. "Preoccupied leaders make for uncertain missions." "Agreed, but until he gives us reason to act otherwise, we follow orders." Back in the command hub, Captain Cannell isolated a signal on the holographic display, a faint but unmistakable sign of life emanating from a small blue planet ahead. His eyes lit up with a mix of ambition and something else, obsession. Cannell's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind already racing ahead. The prospect of adding a human specimen to his collection was too enticing to ignore. Elsewhere, Petrick reviewed medical logs, ensuring that all crew members' osmium implants were functioning optimally. The implants were critical for regulating their physiology during extended space travel. Satisfied, he closed the file and glanced up to see Thurks approaching. "Medical officer," she greeted. "Any concerns to report?" "None. The crew is in excellent health," he replied, "though I suspect stress levels may rise if certain rumors are true." She folded her arms. "What have you heard?" "That we're altering course towards a Class M planet within a protected zone. Such deviations tend to have repercussions." Thurks sighed. "Keep an eye on the crew's well-being. We'll need everyone at their best." "Of course," Petrick agreed. "And Thurks, if you need any assistance, don't hesitate to ask." She offered a faint smile. "Appreciated." In the engine room, Sizcott felt the subtle shift as the ship adjusted its trajectory. He tapped into the console, confirming his suspicions. "We're changing course," he muttered. Ron glanced over. "So it's true then. The captain's going off mission." "Seems that way. I just hope he knows what he's doing." "Hope," Ron said flatly, "is a weak strategy." Captain Cannell stood at the helm of the observation deck, the vast expanse of space unfurling before him like a pitch-black canvas. The stars shimmered against the void, each one a distant system waiting to be discovered, catalogued, possessed. His eyes, only a shade lighter than the abyss outside, reflected a hunger that went beyond mere exploration. "Captain, we've completed the barium scans," First Officer Thurks reported, strolling through the door, her voice crisp with professionalism. She handed him a silver datapad, the device glowing softly in the dim light of the bridge. "All readings are within expected parameters. We can proceed with the extraction as scheduled." Cannell glanced at the datapad briefly before setting it aside. "Very good, Thurks," he said, his tone absent. His gaze drifted back to the stars, or rather, to the blue-green orb that had just come into view, a planet teeming with untapped potential. Thurks noticed his distraction. "Is there something else on your mind, sir?" He folded his hands behind his back, the fabric of his uniform taut across his shoulders. "Tell me, Thurks, what do you know about Earth?" She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Earth? It's a Class M planet in the Sol system. Primitive technology, diverse ecosystems, a variety of sentient life forms. It's designated as a non-interference zone under the Galactic Accord." "Precisely," Cannell replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "A world rich in biological diversity, yet largely unexplored by our kind. Think of the specimens we could acquire, the knowledge we could gain." Thurks's expression tightened. "Captain, our mission is to harvest barium from the local star. Diverting to Earth would not only violate mission protocols, but also the non-interference principles we are bound to uphold." He waved a dismissive hand. "Protocols can be adjusted. Besides, consider the benefits. The scientific advancements we could achieve by studying a human specimen firsthand. Our understanding of bipedal primates is rudimentary at best." "With all due respect, sir, this seems ill-advised," she cautioned. "The risks outweigh the potential gains, and the ethical implications—" "Ethics," Cannell interrupted, turning to face her fully. "We are explorers, pioneers of knowledge. It is our duty to push boundaries." Before she could respond, Science Officer Flea appeared, her sharp eyes darting between them. "Captain, Threx," she greeted. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are we discussing a potential new mission parameter?" "Indeed we are," Cannell affirmed. "I intend to initiate a collection protocol for a human sample set." Flea raised an eyebrow, a hint of intrigue flickering across her face. "A human? That would be unprecedented. The data we could gather." "Precisely my thinking," Cannell said, his enthusiasm mounting. "Imagine the breakthroughs in xenobiology." Thurx stepped forward. "Captain, I must object. Diverting to Earth would compromise our primary mission and violate the Galactic Accord." Cannell's gaze hardened. "Objection noted, First Officer, but the decision stands. Flea, begin preparations for an extraction operation." Flea nodded, already mentally cataloguing the equipment and protocols required. "I'll coordinate with Chief Engineer Siscott to modify our containment facilities." "Excellent," Cannell replied, a satisfied glint in his eye. "Dismissed." Thax remained rooted in place as Flea exited. "Sir, I urge you to reconsider." He sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Thurx, I value your counsel, but this is an opportunity we cannot let slip away. History favors the bold." "Boldness should not come at the expense of our integrity," she insisted, "or the safety of our crew." "Safety?" He chuckled dryly. "We are more than equipped to handle one primitive life form." "Underestimating the unknown has been the downfall of many," she warned. Cannell stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Your concern is noted, but remember your place. I expect your full cooperation." Thurx stiffened, a flash of frustration crossing her features before she composed herself. "Yes, Captain." "Good," he said, turning away. "You are dismissed." She left the bridge, her mind roiling with unease. The corridors seemed colder than usual, the hum of the ship's engines a distant murmur. As she made her way to the crew quarters, she passed Pilot Slow lounging against a bulkhead. "Thurx, you look like you've seen a Traflamadorian up close," he quipped, his eyes gleaming with mischief. She paused, debating whether to confide in him. "It's the captain. He's redirecting our mission." "Oh? That doesn't sound like him." "He's obsessed with collecting a human sample set from Earth." He let out a low whistle. "Ambitious. Risky, too. What's your take?" "I think it's a mistake," she admitted. "But he's not open to dissent." Slow shrugged. "Well, he's the captain. Maybe it'll all work out." "Or maybe it'll lead us into unnecessary hassle," she countered. "Guess we'll find out," he said lightly, pushing off the wall. In the meantime, I've got some nav charts to update. Thurex watched him go, her unease deepening. She knew Cannell's fascination with species collection bordered on obsession, but this was a step too far. Meanwhile, in the engineering bay, Flea approached Siscott, who was elbow-deep in circuitry. "Siscott, I need your assistance," she said without preamble. He glanced up, his hands never pausing. "What is it this time, Flea?" "Captain's orders. We're modifying the containment units for a high-threat biological specimen." He frowned. "High threat? We're not equipped for that. What kind of specimen?" "A primate type. They call themselves humans," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. Siscott stared at her. "You're serious?" "Deadly," she confirmed. "Can you make the adjustments?" He sighed heavily. "I'll need to reroute power and reinforce the barriers. It's doable, but not without challenges." "Challenges are what we excel at," she remarked dryly. Back on the bridge, Cannell monitored the ship's trajectory as Earth grew larger on the view screen. He felt a surge of excitement, a sensation that had become increasingly rare amidst the routine of their missions. This was his chance to make a mark, to bring back something truly extraordinary. Patrick entered quietly, his gaze assessing. "Captain, I've received word that the medical bay is being prepped for a primate specimen. Is this accurate?" "It is," Cannell affirmed. "We'll need your expertise in xenomedicine." "Of course," Patrick said evenly. "I'll ensure everything is ready." "Excellent," Cannell replied. "I have full confidence in your abilities." As Patrick departed, Cannell allowed himself a moment to revel in the anticipation. He knew the risks, knew that he was bending, perhaps even breaking, the protocols that had been drilled into him throughout his career, but the potential rewards outweighed any repercussions. In the crew lounge, whispers began to circulate. The atmosphere shifted subtly as word spread of the captain's unorthodox orders. Some, like Flea, were intrigued by the scientific prospects. Others, like Thurks, harbored deep reservations. Ron sat alone, meticulously adjusting a piece of equipment. He watched as the others exchanged hushed conversations, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke up. "Is this mission drift worth the potential fallout?" Flea glanced over. "Progress often requires a departure from the norm." "Progress shouldn't compromise our principles," Ron countered. She shrugged. "Principles can be redefined." Thux entered the lounge, tension evident in her posture. "We need to be prepared for any outcome. Ensure that all safety protocols are double-checked." "Already ahead of you," Siscott called from a corner, his tone weary. The crew settled into an uneasy silence, each lost in their thoughts. The ship's hum seemed louder, the walls closing in as they approached the point of no return. In his quarters, Cannell stood before a collection of samples preserved in suspended animation, a testament to his journeys and the knowledge he had amassed. He traced a finger along the casing of an exotic plant, its iridescent petals frozen in time. "This will be my legacy," he murmured to himself. "They'll understand in time." Back on the bridge, the navigational system signaled their arrival in Earth's orbit. Cannell took his seat, the weight of command settling comfortably on his shoulders. "Initiate cloaking," he ordered. "Maintain geosynchronous orbit over the designated coordinates." Solo's hands moved deftly over the controls. "Cloaking engaged. We're in position." "Begin scanning for suitable specimens," Cannell commanded. Thurks approached hesitantly. "Sir, last chance to reconsider." He met her gaze steadily. "Noted, First Officer. Proceed with the mission." She stepped back, resigned but resolute. "Yes, Captain." As the ship settled into orbit, a sense of inevitability hung in the air. The crew moved with purpose, each fulfilling their roles despite the undercurrents of doubt and anticipation. In the lab, Flea prepared the containment unit, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. Siscott finalized the modifications, his face etched with concern. "Let's hope this is worth it," he muttered. Flea gave a half-smile. For science, it always is. As Earth loomed below, the thin line between ambition and folly began to blur, and the true cost of prioritizing personal interests over duty remained to be seen.
That's where our transmission cuts off, leaving us with a crew on the brink, their fate suspended in the darkness of Earth's orbit. The captain's ambition, the crew's whispered doubts, and that lingering promise of a forbidden harvest have all been laid bare for a moment before the signal flickers into silence. We've seen them cloak their vessel and prepare to breach the final barrier between the known and the forbidden. And now, as the feed fades, questions remain. What will become of this unorthodox mission? Will the ethics of ambition collapse under the weight of its own secrets? And most unsettling of all, what fate awaits that lonely lumberjack, taken against his will and thrown into a world beyond his comprehension? Keep your ear to the void, dear listener. The transmission may yet resume, and if it does, the truth, hidden in the dark, is bound to come crashing through the silence.
The rules should tend to be television.